I want you to think about this. If you could describe parenting in one word, what would that word be? Love. That's usually the first one you hear. I've asked that question in seminars and workshops that I've done on fatherhood and parenting. And I say, how would you describe it in one word? And you hear the word love. You hear the word overtime. You hear the word patience. And I asked this one time in a church service, and someone in the very back said, parenting is hard. He just yelled it out. It's hard. Yes, it is hard work. I actually heard a parent one time say, parenting is cooking. That's what parenting is. She says, I spend so much time in the kitchen, I feel that's what my parenting is all about. Yesterday, we were at a T-ball all-star tournament. My word, there should be a reality show on stuff like that, because that's parenting on a different level. But no one really uses this word here, and I believe that this is one word that describes what parenting is. Parenting is discipleship. I believe this is the one word that describes parenting more than any other word, discipleship. As parents, we are teachers. So the first point we're making this morning is that confident parenting is a discipleship journey. Proverbs chapter 22, verse 15, folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline will drive it far from him. Very familiar passage. Folly bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline will drive it far from him. The question is, what are we trying to discipline? That's an important question. Contrary to popular belief, this verse is not speaking about behavior modification. Listen to this. The verse says to discipline the folly, the foolishness of a child's heart. In other words, our goal as parents, as fathers, is to help our children grow, mature, and be responsible. This is the essence of discipleship, growth and maturity. Now, please note the word discipline comes from the word disciple. A disciple is one who is in training as a student. This person is learning and growing spiritually, and Jesus, the master teacher, taught his disciples with love, grace, and with mercy. So to discipline my child means to teach my child to be a responsible young person, to embrace the values we have as a family. Does my child understand the value of hard work? What about other values of integrity, honesty, purity in relationships and in friendships as well? I want to make this very clear before we dive into this a little bit more. I'm not part of the anti-spanking movement, okay? But I'm also not part of the movement that promotes punishment, fear, and intimidation, because I don't find that in Scripture. And I asked this question, what does it look like if you are parenting from a discipleship model? And I use that exact word, instead of a punishment model. And one of the master sergeants in there said, sir, can I give you an example that I think relates? Love the military. They always tell you, sir, 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 sir. I said, yes, sir, you can. And he said a couple years ago, I was in my son's room. I'm going back with this story. So he talks about how he was in his son's room and he heard the music coming from his shuffle. And he picked up and listened to what the song was. And he said, as I was listening to this music, I heard some of the most vulgar, inappropriate things being said about women. And I was a little upset that my son was listening to this music. He goes on to say, he said, I was about to take it to my child. Those were his exact words. I was about to take it to my son. Didn't know exactly what he meant by that, but my imagination went there. He said, but then I decided I really want to teach my son something. I just don't want to get mad at him. I want to teach him something. So this dad was pretty savvy, goes to the internet, finds the name of the song, and finds the words, prints out the words of the song. So this was a family. They had 2 teenagers. This family was on the go all the time, and they would have like family meetings 2 or 3 times a month. So later that day, he told his son, he said, hey, we're having a family meeting tomorrow, at this particular time. And his teenage son said, yes, sir, Dad, I'll be there. He said, yeah, about the meeting tomorrow. Handing him a piece of paper, he says, I want you to come to our meeting, and I'm going to give you a moment to read the words that are on this piece of paper. Son looked at it, looked at his dad. I could just see his eyes getting yay big. What the, he was. And he said, but Dad, son, it's okay. You have my permission to read those words in our family meeting tomorrow in the presence of your mother and your sister. Speechless. And he said, Dad, I don't think I can do that. Well, why not? Dad, because these words are inappropriate. And I cannot say these things in front of Mom and in front of my sister. And his dad looked at him and said, do you understand what I'm trying to teach you, son? Yes, sir, I do. That's a discipleship model. That's a teaching model. When I was a youth minister back in the mid-90s, early 90s, 25 plus years ago, parents would take a situation like this, many good Christian parents trying to do the right thing, and they would go and remove the stereo system. Let's get rid of the boom box. They're like, we're taking control, Pastor Vince, over this situation. We even took down the door. We removed the hinges from the door, took down the door. We took down all the posters. And even at the time, being, 24, 25 years old, I'm thinking, what is that going to accomplish? I'll tell you what they were trying to do. They were trying to get some type of control over the situation. Somehow, some way, taking off the door, removing the TV, and, the internet was still in its infancy back then. Somehow, some way, they were trying to take control. This father and the example I gave you with his son, that's taking control of the situation. Confident parenting is a discipleship journey. When we do more teaching, less punishment, we will see greater results. I guarantee it. Secondly, confident parenting affirms the strengths of children. Proverbs chapter 22, verse 6, another very familiar passage. Train a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not turn from it. As fathers and teachers, we affirm the strengths of our children. Today's social worker and counselor is trained to work from what we call a strength-based model. In other words, every child has strengths to build upon. Some of these strengths and abilities are yet to be developed or yet to be nurtured and cultivated. And we're going to share a quote with you by Chuck Swindoll, one of my favorite writers. He's a renowned scholar and educator, and he gives this commentary on this passage. He says, we're to train a child according to his or her characteristic manner. Some will be artistic, others athletic, and still others academic. One may be strong-willed and another compliant. Swindoll continues, the parent finds ways to encourage behavior that makes everyone happy and satisfies the child's deepest needs. And it involves guiding a wild spirit at times, in other words, in order to give it purpose and direction. Chuck Swindoll also goes on to talk about a tree and its natural bent. And he goes on to say that children have a natural bent in a certain direction, especially when you consider the branches. They're designed to grow in a certain direction. They have a natural bent. And as I was reading this, I thought about our home in San Antonio where we had this large magnolia tree in front of the house. And many of the homes in that area had oak trees. But we had this big magnolia tree that grew so big, pretty much covered up the entire front of the house. And I thought, man, we really need to get this thing trimmed. So in the community we lived in, an arborist had to come out and do the trimming and the cutting or whatever you wanted. So we had an arborist come out, and I said, "Sir, we really need this magnolia trimmed up. It's hanging really low. It's, it can get real messy. It's hard to keep up and maintained." And I said, "You see that oak tree down the road? I'd like to see if you could trim it up that way." And I'm sorry, but I had ignorance about trees at the time, especially magnolia trees. Well, I know everything you need to know about magnolia trees. I mean, how they got down to the South, and Thomas Jefferson was a big magnolia tree guy, and people wanted to look, wanted things to look like up in D.C., and so they started bringing trees down here. And anyway, so he's looking at the magnolia. He says, "You want this tree to look like that tree down there?" I said, "Yes, sir, if you could trim it up that way." And he just looked at me, and he knew I had no idea what I was talking about. So he goes up to the tree, and he put his hand on the tree and closed his eyes. And I said, "Oh my goodness, this is a bona fide tree hugger right here. He is serious about trees." He just put his hand, and he came up to me. He said, "Sir, I understand what you want. I get it. This tree hangs low. It spreads out the way it does." He said, "But I cannot trim this tree like the oak tree over there." He said, "If I do that, I'm going to be hurting this tree, and I don't want to do that. This tree is not designed to be trimmed up the way you want it. In fact, these magnolia trees are designed to hang low. They're designed to be this way. So if I start cutting and chopping it all up, it's going to hurt the tree, and I don't want to do that." And I thought, you win. You're the arborist. I'm the person who doesn't know anything about trees. But I emphasize this point today because there are a lot of stressed out parents trying to fit their children into a square when God has created them to be a triangle. Third point I want to emphasize this morning is that confident parenting must be intentional. If we're going to be successful parents, we must be intentional about our activities, our actions, and our behaviors. Good parenting does not just happen. Confident parenting is a practice and a process. I'm going to say that again. Confident parenting is a practice and a process. Let's look at Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4. It reads like this: "If you do not shut your mouth, I'm going to give you something to cry about." Ouch. I know it doesn't say that. Okay. It really says this right here: "I brought you into this world, and I can take you out." That's what Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4 says. What a thing to say to a child. Maybe jokingly, ha 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 for the moment, but in an intense moment, what are we trying to communicate at that moment? Ownership? Property? Yeah, to a certain extent. During Roman times, we can give a whole discourse, a historical perspective on the father's right during Roman times, where he actually had the authority to kill his child. Yeah, it was that brutal. Yeah, there was no CPS number back then. No child protective services around. But that's an idea of ownership and property. But as you think on it on a spiritual level, if you're speaking to a child that way, you're like, this is God's creation that he's entrusted you to love, nurture, and disciple, and yet we would speak to them in that way. We would speak that way to a holy, sanctified creation of God. We would act like we have the authority to speak in that tone, in that manner, and in that kind of motivation. Shame on us. Shame on us as parents, as adults. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord. You know, what are the guiding principles of the Lord's discipline and instruction? When I look at the subject headings of the teaching of Christ, I see mercy. I see forgiveness. I see love. I see truth. I see the Sermon on the Mount, which pretty much summarizes the teachings of Christ in Christianity. You know, when my kids see me as a father, when they see me as a parent, do they see a reflection of the discipline and the instruction of Christ? Do they see that? Do they see in me? Do they see truth? Do they see love? Do they see mercy? If not, maybe it's time to become more intentional about my parenting. I leave you with this quote here. Every father should remember that one day his son will follow his example instead of his advice. I'm going to bring things to a close, and Pastor Paul's going to make his way up here. David Blankenhorn, in his book, Fatherless America, he also said this right here. He said that today's man is not perfect. Like I said, we're a work under construction. We don't have it all figured out. In a few minutes, I'll be outside trying to break up my kids, and I'll be yelling for Pastor Delia to come over and help me a little. He said, today's man, today's father is not perfect, but he's good enough to be irreplaceable. Whew, that's good. And I would say that to every dad here, every man, you are good enough to be irreplaceable. What's the one thing you can do as a father? What's the one thing you can do that's going to leave a lasting impact on your children? It's this right here. You show their mom how much you love her. Show their mom just how much you love her. You do that, look out. That's a good place to start.